Who are the Sierra Leonean Creole people? Where did they come from? The Creole people of Sierra Leone have a unique story and ancestry. They are not considered to be one of the indigenous tribes of Sierra Leone because of their history and origins. The Creole people's origins come from various parts of West and Central Africa. From 1619 to the mid-1700s, their ancestors were captured from these regions and enslaved in the America and the Caribbean. They were predominantly being sent to the American colonies of Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. Their ancestors would become amongst those who would help to form the Gullah Geechee community. In 1775 to 76, the Revolutionary War would begin. A major event that initiated it would be when the Americans decided to declare its independence from Britain and form the United States of America. This declaration was written up by Thomas Jefferson, and he identifies the inhabitants of the 13 colonies as one people. The declaration simultaneously dissolved political links with Britain while including a long list of alleged violations of English rights committed by King George III. The British wanted to maintain control over its colonies, and they would attempt to do so by any means, even through warfare if necessary. This tension between Britain and America created a dilemma where the Americans had to choose who they would give their allegiance to. The American patriots referred to those who supported independence and freedom from Britain. The loyalists were white Americans, who were still remaining loyal to the British Crown. But to increase the numbers in their troops and cripple the economy of America, the British incentivized the black slaves owned by the Patriots to join the British troops in exchange for their freedom. They would go on to be called the Black Loyalists. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore issued a controversial proclamation. As Virginia's royal governor, he called on all able-bodied men to assist him in fighting against the Patriots. Within a month, about 800 slaves or former slaves had fled to Norfolk, Virginia to enlist. Lord Dunmore would take these 800 former slaves and form an army called the Ethiopian Regiment. A link to a small list of former slaves from his morning reports from those who accompanied him will be shared below. After the capture of Savannah, Georgia, and the siege of Charleston in 1780, thousands of enslaved people escaped from plantations and fled to British lines in Charleston to join their troops. America would defeat the British in 1781, but fortunately, the British still upheld their deal with the formerly enslaved black loyalists. In 1783, about 3,000 blacks were registered in the Book of Negroes, a document that records the names, descriptions, former masters, and the different states that these former slaves came from. Due to their fugitive status in America, they were also granted certificates of freedom and evacuated out of the country via New York to Nova Scotia, Canada. The white loyalists would also be evacuated with them as well. The black loyalists who were not evacuated to Nova Scotia would be resettled in Jamaica or London. Those who went to London would be referred to as the quote-unquote poor blacks of London. Though these blacks in London were predominantly formerly enslaved people, they were also blacks who descended from Jewish and Muslim Moors who invaded and resided in Europe from North Africa and held power from 711 AD to 1492 when they were defeated at Granada. Around 1596, Queen Elizabeth I expressed her annoyance of the blackamoors' presence still lingering in London, even after most of them were deported back to North Africa. So together, a branch of black loyalists from America and the black Moors made up the poor blacks of London. Due to their extreme poverty and state of hopelessness, a resettlement scheme was formed to relocate them to the new British colony of Sierra Leone. By the end of October 1786, a transport ship was commissioned and docked at Deptford. The applicants for the settlement were to sign an agreement agreeing to the condition that they would retain status as British subjects and were to be defended by the British Armed Forces. They were then given a document granting them citizenship of Sierra Leone. They initially had 700 blacks who signed up, but only 441 of them actually went through with it. In January of 1787, two ships called the Atlantic and the Belisarius set sail for Sierra Leone, but bad weather forced them to divert to Plymouth, during which time about 50 passengers died. Another 24 were discharged and 23 ran away. Eventually, after more recruitment, 411 passengers set sail for Sierra Leone in April of 1787. On the voyage between Plymouth and Sierra Leone, 96 passengers died en route, which left only 315. The ones that managed to survive the voyage arrived on the shore of Sierra Leone on May 15, 1787, and established Granville Town, which was basically a proto-Freetown. When the ships left them in September, their numbers had been reduced to 276 people, consisting of 212 black men, 30 black women, 5 white men, and 29 white women. The settlers that remained forcibly captured the land from an African chief, but he retaliated, attacking the settlement, which reduced their numbers to 64 settlers, now consisting of 39 black men, 19 black women, and 6 white women. Unfortunately, some of these settlers will be recaptured by slave raiders and sold back into slavery, mostly in Spanish and Portuguese-speaking countries. After Granville Town failed and the population was nearly decimated, the British organizers of Sierra Leone had a new resettlement plan, and they needed to repopulate the colony. So this time, they decided to recruit the black loyalists who were evacuated from America to Nova Scotia. Prior to the recruitment, the black loyalists had already been expressing their unsatisfaction and grievances about their conditions in Nova Scotia. The land was not fertile, the weather was harsh, and the white loyalists were subjugating the black loyalists and taking most of the jobs. They would leave them with the menial work or force them into a situation where they would have to succumb to indentured servitude. All of these tribulations were documented by a black loyalist named Thomas Peters. He and many other influential blacks of the community were pressing out the British Crown to fulfill their promises to the blacks, such as promise of land grants. The British had no resistance to these requests because the timing of it all fell completely in alignment with the goals and agenda of the British Crown and the heads of Sierra Leonean resettlement plan. They needed to repopulate the Sierra Leone colony, and the Black Loyalists of Canada were the perfect candidates. So in 1792, roughly 1,200 out of the 3,000 Black Loyalists were recruited to be resettled in Sierra Leone. And because of their former slave status in the Americas, these settlers would name the capital Freetown as a symbol of their liberation. This group formed a successful society unlike their predecessors who came from London. Meanwhile, in Jamaica, there was a group of black rebels called the Maroons. They were former slaves who escaped their plantations, then settled amongst the Taino Indians in the mountainous regions of the island, where they would eventually form multiple communities of refuge for runaway slaves to join. The Maroons fought 2 wars against the British, and after the Second War, the main leaders, instigators, and people of influence in the Maroon community were deported off of the island. In 1796, 581 Treilani Maroons were transported to Nova Scotia, but another 58 stayed behind in Jamaica and either forged careers as free persons of color or joined a kampong town. During the ship's voyage, 17 Maroons died. During the first winter between 1796 and 97, which was a bitter one, another 19 Maroons died. During this winter, another 5 Maroons were born, and in 1797, the surgeon John Oxley counted 550 Maroons in Nova Scotia. The Maroons, like their black loyalist predecessors, were unsatisfied with their resettlement in Nova Scotia and requested to be settled in the Sierra Leone colony. So in the year 1800, the Maroons were resettled in the Sierra Leone colony amongst the black loyalists who also came from Nova Scotia. In 1807, the British would abolish slavery in all of its colonies, but this would not stop countries like Spain and Portugal from still making illegal slave raids on liberated and native blacks in the British colonies of Africa. In 1808, following the British declaring the abolition of slavery, they would form the West African Squadron. Their role was to suppress the Atlantic slave trade by patrolling the coast of West Africa. This was successful to a large degree because they were able to intercept a large percentage of slave ships that raided the coast and attempted to transport them to places like Cuba and Brazil. After these ships were intercepted, these recaptives would be settled in Sierra Leone and they would be known as liberated Africans. In 1827, some of the Sierra Leone Creoles will be recruited and transported to Bioko Island in Equatorial Guinea to take up work on cocoa and yam plantations. They are heavily populated in the Malabo region. Over time, a full Creole community would form in Equatorial Guinea known as the Fernandinos. In the 1830s, The Saro community emerged out of the Sierra Leonean Creole group, and they would begin migrating to Nigeria. They were liberated Africans and children of the liberated Africans ancestrally from the Yoruba who resettled in Sierra Leone after the slave ships they were being transported on were intercepted by Britain's West African Squadron. They would serve as middlemen between Sierra Leone and Nigeria. Another Creole group that would emerge would be called the Aku people. The Aku people were Sierra Leonean captives whose slave ships were intercepted by the British, but instead of being resettled back in Sierra Leone, they were resettled in Gambia. These Gambian Aku were also ancestrally Yoruba, but there were also Aku who descend from the Nova Scotian and Caribbean black loyalists who were settled in Sierra Leone initially but migrated to Gambia. While living in Sierra Leone, many Creole residents became exposed to the Christian faith as a result of the work of British missionaries who established some churches, a few grammar schools, and a pioneer educational institution, the Fora Bay College. Relatively, the residents of Sierra Leone soon gained a fast start in Western education and were soon well trained and experienced in medicine, law, and the civil service. Many of them graduated from grammar schools and became administrative workers for the British imperial interest in the country. By the middle of the 19th century, some of the African elite in Sierra Leone began to migrate to Nigeria, especially the colony of Lagos for economic reasons. Some were administrative personnel who were reassigned to Lagos. An expedition of the River Niger by Ajayi Crowther furthered the evangelical interest of many Sierra Leoneans toward Nigeria, many of them having joined the missionaries in their effort. In 1841, an estimated 200 Maroons in Sierra Leone responded to the British call for indentured labor in Jamaica on sugar plantations. They would resettle to the Jamaican Maroon village of Flagstaff in St. James Parish. A branch of the Creoles from the Black Loyalist wave would also be a part of this emigration, mainly for economic purposes. Some would return back to Sierra Leone after acquiring a trade in Jamaica and fulfilling the terms of their indentured servitude, while others would remain in Jamaica. Those who remained on the island were already mostly of Maroon origin, and Africans who established themselves within the Jamaican economy. Between 1841 and 1851, many Sierra Leonean Creoles also went to Trinidad as migrant workers. They would settle in the region of present-day Belmont, but it was originally called Freetown, and they would even have a street called Sierra Leone Road that commemorates the indentured service that arrived from Sierra Leone to Trinidad. The greater majority of Creole migrant workers would settle in British Guyana. Indentured African immigrants entered the Caribbean in the following numbers. 13,970 would go to British Guyana, 10,000 would go to Jamaica, 8,390 to Trinidad, 1,540 to Grenada, 1,040 to St. Vincent, 730 to St. Lucia, and 460 would go to St. Kitts. Ancestrally, about 400 of them would come from the Kru-speaking people of Liberia and Ivory Coast and Sierra Leone. 16,290 of them would come from the islands of St. Helena, and 15,630 of them would come directly from Sierra Leone. The Sierra Leonean Creoles predominantly went to Guyana, Jamaica, and Trinidad, while others migrated to other islands at smaller degrees. So overall, the combination of all of these cultures, traditions, and dialects would form the Sierra Leonean Creole community, and also the Creole language spoken amongst them, which had a very strong element of Geechee from South Carolina, Jamaican Patois, Yoruba, and Native African elements fused together. Genetically, the Sierra Leonean Creole are an amalgamation of many different backgrounds. The admixtures they would receive from the Black Poor of London would consist of various African backgrounds, the Black Moors of England who were originally North African, and small European admixture that would be passed down through some interracial unions. The admixture received from the Black Loyalists consisted of Africans and children of Africans who came from the Bantu of Angola and Congo, the Wolof, Mandinka, Fulani, Jola, and Balanta of Senegambia and Guinea, and the Mende, Shebro, and Timni from Sierra Leone. The Maroons would introduce the Akan, Igbo, and Taino admixtures to the Creole gene pool, and the liberated African descendants would introduce the Yoruba and Hausa admixture, as well as other Nigerian ethnic groups at a smaller degree. So let's do a review of how the current Sierra Leonean Creole community was formed through 4 waves. The first wave, The black loyalists from Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and the New England region of America who were resettled in Sierra Leone in 1792 via Nova Scotia after giving allegiance to the British against the Americans during the Revolutionary War. The second wave were the Maroon rebels from Jamaica who were exiled to Sierra Leone in 1800 via Nova Scotia after the Second Maroon War. It also wasn't uncommon for Maroons and rebels from different Caribbean islands to be exiled to Sierra Leone either. A group of rebels from Barbados would also be exiled to Sierra Leone in 1816 as well, after Booth's Rebellion. And in 1844, the same thing would happen to Afro-Cubans after the Conspiracy de la Escalera. The third wave would be the liberated Africans who were Yoruba predominantly, along with the Hausa, Igbo, and Afik from Nigeria and the Akan of Ghana, who were rescued by the British West African Squadron from being transported across the Atlantic by enslavers who violated the British Anti-Slavery Act after 1807. These recaptives were settled in Sierra Leone as Krio, Gambia as Aku, and Nigeria as Saro. There were also a group of Yoruba who adopted the religion of Islam from traders who came from Mali that settled in Benin and southwest Nigeria. When the Portuguese slave raiders captured them, the West African Squadron was not successful in rescuing them, so they made the full voyage to Brazil. These Yoruba, along with the Hausa, started an insurrection called the Mali Revolt. Many Yoruba and Hausa gained their freedom through this revolt and were resettled to Sierra Leone, where they are now known as Forobe people. Some of them would also accompany the Saro when they began migrating to Nigeria. And this concludes my series on the Sierra Leone people, but there will be more to come. The DNA and history of Sierra Leone comes from revolutionaries who didn't allow their oppressors to subjugate them. We are the people who could not be enslaved or defeated. We are the people who rose from the ashes after every battle and recreated ourselves and our reality. To know thyself is to know your history. In Salon, we say, if you don't know how you come, you don't know how you go. Like, comment, and subscribe to my channel to stay updated with all future content. Peace, love, and gratitude.